how could Jeremy Corbyn's new Labour affect the political situation in the UK up until the next general election in 2020? So we've got Labour in the middle here, and it'll be interesting to look at where Labour votes go and which votes Labour may pick up as a result of Jeremy Corbyn now being the new leader of the Labour Party. The Green Party traditionally attracts younger, quite progressive left-wing votes, and it's sort of the left-wing protest party, the party outside of the so-called Westminster elite on the left, and that a lot of people vote for. However, now Corbyn is the leader of the Labour Party with his very anti-austerity socialist type vision. It's likely that a lot of former Green voters who became disenfranchised with the new Labour Party will actually go back, since Labour is now apparently going to its more traditional roots. So it's likely that the Green Party is going to bleed a lot of votes towards Labour, since the Green Party no longer really offers anything unique politically, simply because the Labour Party is now taken up the guise of what the Green Party used to represent. So the next biggest party in terms of overall national vote share is the SNP, which, even though overall has only marginally more votes than the Green Party, it completely dominates on a regional level in Scotland, where it picked up 56 out of the possible 59 seats available. So the SNP is ideologically similar to the Green Party, which might explain why the Scottish Green Party is barely 1% of the vote. However, the SNP is also a champion of Scottish independence, and the rise of the SNP came particularly after a marginally failed referendum, where Scotland voted to stay part of the United Kingdom, but only by about 5% of the vote, so it was a 45 to 55% majority. So, with the Labour Party under Corbyn now going to more towards the SNP's political ideology in a general sense, it's likely that some of the SNP vote is going to start to trickle back to Labour. However, maybe not to the extent of the Greens, because even under Corbyn, Labour probably still wants to keep the UK as a collective state, whereas the SNP would still want the UK to become independent. It's likely, in view of the fact that the Labour Party has adopted a lot of the SNP type political ideology, that the SNP will champion even more aggressively the need for Scotland to become independent, simply to show that it is unique and is not simply a different version of the Labour Party. So next up we have the UK's Liberal Party with 8% of the vote share in 2015. And the Liberal Democrats were considered unambiguously to be the UK's third party, with the third highest number of seats and the third highest vote share. However, as a result of a coalition with the Conservatives in 2010, and in particular a result of a U-turn on their promise to not raise tuition fees, the Lib Dems' reputation was very heavily damaged, and they lost most of their seats in the 2015 election. The Lib Dems in 2015 tried to advocate themselves as a very moderate, centrally based party, not as irresponsible as Labour in terms of economics, but not as aggressive and uncompassionate as the Conservatives. It's quite conceivable that a lot of more moderately centre-left people in Labour Party who might feel disenfranchised by Jeremy Corbyn's very hard left socialist idealism might come back towards the Liberal Democrats. That is, of course, if the Labour Party doesn't completely split into two. So the Liberal Democrats are looking potentially quite viable again, with some Labour votes being mopped up by the Liberal Democrats as very probable. Next we have, with 13% of the national vote share, the UK Independence Party. So the UK Independence Party primarily stands for UK independence from the European Union, and ideologically is fairly similar to the Conservative Party. So it's important to look at the referendum, because the vote migration from or to UKIP is going to depend on the result of the referendum. If we stay in the European Union, that is, we secure a yes vote, then it's likely that a lot of very unhappy Eurosceptics in both Labour and the Conservative Party might move towards UKIP. Jeremy Corbyn actually is Eurosceptic, although he seems to have been coerced by other members of his party to adopt a positive stance towards the EU. So it's conceivable that were the UK to stay in the European Union, a lot of Eurosceptic Labour voters would migrate towards UKIP, and there would be a lot of disenfranchised Conservative voters that would go towards UKIP as well. So with both parties perhaps losing votes to UKIP in the event that we stay in the European Union, it's perhaps a little bit difficult to say who is going to be in government in 2020. However, should the reverse happen and we win the referendum and the UK leaves the European Union, it's likely that perhaps something akin to the reverse will happen, with the UK Independence Party becoming obsolete and neoliberal-minded people from UKIP moving towards the Conservative parties. The Liberals in UKIP might move towards the Liberal Democrats, and perhaps some of the Corbyn supporters, of which there are many in UKIP, would move towards Labour. So, in order to gauge an understanding of exactly how Corbyn is going to take us towards the next general election, I think the second most important event here is the referendum. Finally, let's look at a possible Conservative-Labour vote swing. The Conservative with 37% of the national vote and holding government at the moment. It's quite difficult to easily say because these two parties are mirror images of each other, ideologically speaking. There are a lot of Blairites, those of the more moderate centre-left in Labour, that are not going to like Corbyn at all. And it's conceivable that some people, as an act of protest, may move to Labour's arch-enemy, the Conservative Party. Although, ideologically speaking, the Liberal Democrats would be a far more sensible choice in terms of policy. There may also be, on an unrelated note, an attempted coup in the Labour Party, with perhaps even the party splitting up into two separate entities, as it did with the SDP. So this becomes increasingly harder to predict, although a lot of people, at least those of Blairite perspective, think that the Labour Party is now going to be in permanent opposition, so they're not going to be pleased about this. So while I can understand some people migrating from Labour Party to Conservative, it's hard to exactly see how the converse would be true, why any Conservatives would possibly migrate to an even more left-wing government in Jeremy Corbyn. At least in UKIP it can be mildly understood, with Corbyn's Euroscepticism and appeal to the working class, just as UKIP sometimes appeals to the working class. But with the Conservatives, it's far more difficult to imagine a Conservative voter migrating to an even more left-wing Labour government, or Labour Party that is. So to conclude, what does Corbyn mean for the Labour Party? Well, it's likely that Corbyn will pick up some votes from the grand alliance of the left in the form of the Green Party, the SNP, and perhaps some of the other regional parties like Plaid Cymru in Wales. However, a lot of people in the Labour Party who strongly disapprove of Corbyn's policies, for example, they want to disband Trident, are more likely to move to the right, particularly towards the Liberal Democrats, and in the event that the UK does not secede from the European Union, perhaps to UKIP. And while I'm not entirely sure that there will be a massive Labour-Conservative swing, I do think the Labour Party is not going to gain votes from Jeremy Corbyn as new leader, although they might not bleed as many votes as some people in the media are suggesting.